U.S. President Barack Obama said he will present his strategy on Wednesday for defeating the violent jihadist group ISIS. The Sunni militants rampaged through Iraq and Syria and the Syria border region this summer. They also beheaded 2 American journalists. In an interview with NBC, the president said it's time to go on the offensive against ISIS.
I just want the American people to understand the nature of the threat and how we're going to deal with it. This is not the equivalent of the Iraq War. What this is similar to the kinds of counterterrorism campaigns that we've been engaging in consistently over the last 5, 6, 7 years.
Many on Capitol Hill have been frustrated with President Obama's response so far, especially Republicans like Florida Senator Marco Rubio.
I believe this president has committed presidential malpractice in his foreign policy.
In a New York Times op-ed, California Democratic Senator Dianne Feinstein wrote, "If the United States fails to unite and lead the world against ISIS's horrific goals, we could suffer the consequences for decades to come." Earlier, I spoke with former Director of Foreign Policy at the Century Foundation, also International Affairs and Security expert Jeff Laurenti, to get his take. Jeff, it's always good to see you and good to talk to you. Of course, everybody is anticipating what President Barack Obama is going to say when he addresses the nation on Wednesday. What do you think this strategy will be that he'll lay out?
Well, this is going to be President Obama's own second military intervention. The first was Libya, and there's a lot of dispute about how well or how badly that has turned out. And now this is his intervention to save Iraq from the threat of the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, ISIS for short. And in this, we have these images of American journalists having their throats slit as compelling Washington to act and act forcefully, as well as the spectacle of countless refugees, Christians, Yazidis, and Shia Muslims from the parts of Iraq that the ISIS folks have captured. So I expect that we will see a measured, prudent plan announced in terms of airstrikes, cooperating with perhaps some on-the-ground agents to provide advice, training inside Iraq. The big question is going to be, what is going to be the reach across the border into Syria from which the ISIS folks launched their offensive starting early this year into Iraq?
Indeed, and so many questions around this. Of course, Secretary of State John Kerry, as well as Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, are going into the Mideast this week to get support for whatever this plan will be. How important will coalition building be to the success of this strategy?
Well, I think Americans already learned a dozen years ago from President Bush's invasion of Iraq that doing it on your own is not a formula for success. And indeed, what we are reaping now is the results of a failed policy that hadn't thought about what happens to Iraq the day after you shatter the armies of the old regime. The essential points for Kerry and for Hagel to assemble is support from a very difficult group of cats to herd, because the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Jordanians all have their particular interests, one of which is the preservation of Sunni Islam. They all have a strong religious attachment to that. The Turks now are becoming nervous. They had been leaders initially in the effort to try to erode, if not bring down, President Assad in Syria, and now they're worried about the ISIS-style extremism entering their territory, and they're being caught up in a wider war. The Iranians are what the Saudis are most afraid of in terms of regional balances, and yet if you're looking to do a campaign in Syria, you face the fundamental choice whether you are going to try to see if there's some way to get the Syrian government's at least tacit acquiescence or collaboration, or whether you're going to be entering a three-sided war in Syria against both the government and the ISIS forces. So it's very complicated, very delicate, and there's a great deal of nervousness all around as to how one can pull this off. So if they can pull this off, it will be an astounding sign of the sophistication of the Obama team, sophistication that hasn't quite always worked in every other crisis so far.
So true, but let's talk a little bit about the very tenuous government that's in Iraq. How important it is for the new Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi, to put together a coalition government that is stable in Iraq to make all of this stick.
Well, and this indeed was the problem with the initial American invasion of Iraq 11 years ago. There was no real political strategy. The Obama people have recognized from the start that the military arm is really only secondary to a political strategy. And so they have insisted from the outset of the crisis, when ISIS unexpectedly captured Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, in June, that the Iraqi government, which had been very narrowly Shia, sectarian, exclusive, pushing away the Sunnis who predominate in this quarter of Iraq, that you're going to have to start from scratch in terms of building a new government that is not tainted with this poison of sectarian extremism. And without that, all of your military efforts will come to naught. That they know.
Let me ask you very quickly before I have to let you go. The president has said in media interviews that he's given over the weekend that this is a years-long campaign. It's not something that will happen overnight. But the impression is that it will be a few years, 2, 3 years. Is he a little naive about that? We've been doing airstrike campaigns in Pakistan for 10 years.
Well, I think that you put your finger on it. If this is an airstrike war, then you are not going to be able to eliminate Islamic extremism in any given corner of the world by taking out more of them, since only more will regenerate. That has to be complemented with a strategy on the ground. And the fact that the president is talking about 3 years is at least preparing the American public for the idea that this is a longer-range program. And one hopes that the Congress, if it will step up to its responsibility under war powers in the Constitution to actually authorize military action, will be setting the appropriate limits in terms of scope and of cost to ensure that it is an attainable objective and not one that, like the war on terror, is open-ended and can last for decades.
Yeah, so many moving parts we're all keeping our eyes on. We'll have to leave it right there for now. Jeff Laurenti, as always, thank you so much.
A delight, Debbie.